The late basketball coach and commentator Chuck Daly once said, "It's discouraging to make a mistake, but it's humiliating when you find out you're so unimportant that nobody noticed it."
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with a veteran educator and teaching mentor, your host, Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I talk about how stress turns our hair gray, the discovery of a new type of immune cell, and making mistakes when we're teaching. If you've met me or seen my picture, you know that I have gray hair. Well, not really gray hair. I have dark brown hairs and white hairs, which I call my platinum blonde highlights. But thankfully, most folks stay a polite distance from my head, and the white hairs and brown hairs mix together to produce the perception of gray. Now, I'm 62, so that's not really unexpected. But I think the white hairs came just a bit earlier and in greater quantity than they might otherwise have done, if not for some stressful periods in my life. No. Not having to learn the Krebs cycle, not even my stint as an apprentice lion tamer. Those were more fun than stressful. But other, more stressful things I coped with and thankfully survived. Famously, some world leaders, including U.S. presidents, have gotten much grayer during their terms in office. Now, some of that could simply have been from timing, and they'd have grayed a little bit whether they were in office or not. But now we know of a mechanism for graying of hair through stress. It involves that basic and well-known story of the stress response in all its fight or flight glory. Here's how we currently think it can happen. As we already know, it's the melanocytes in the hair follicle that make the various types of reddish and brownish melanins that end up in the hair shaft. The pheomelanins and the eumelanins that produce reddish or yellowish or brownish or nearly black appearances of our hair. The melanocytes come from stem cells in a part of the follicle called the bulge, which is partway up from the papilla at the bottom of the hair follicle. Which is kind of weird, right, when you think about it? Was like their Latin dictionary misplaced at the time and place that the bulge was named? What kind of anatomical name is that? Bulge. But I digress. Getting back to the story, that bulge is full of stem cells that can and do differentiate into melanocytes. Not all of them at once, just a few of them at a time. Enough that the particular hair being made gets the coloration influenced by genetics and nutrition and other factors. As long as there are some stem cells left behind, they can divide to make more stem cells and therefore more melanocytes. But it's kind of tricky. The speed of these processes has to be matched just so. Otherwise, I'll use up all my stem cells, and darn it, I can't make melanocytes anymore. And all I can make going forward is white hairs in that follicle. Which is fine by me because it makes me look much wiser than I really am. It turns out that the bulge of the hair follicles receives sympathetic adrenergic fibers that release norepinephrine. The norepinephrine stimulates the conversion of more stem cells into melanocytes. That probably doesn't affect hair color that much immediately. After all, another coat of paint isn't going to have that dramatic of an effect, right? But if there's a lot of stress responses going on over time, and therefore I release a lot of norepinephrine, then it's possible that in some of my follicles at least, I'll convert all my stem cells into melanocytes. And that means when the current hair eventually falls out, the hair replacing it will have no melanins. It'll be white. And I'll be wiser, or at least look wiser. Searchable transcript and a captioned audiogram of this episode are funded by AAA, the American Association for Anatomy, at anatomy.org. Hey, there's some new articles posted in the AAA journal called Anatomical Sciences Education, and I want to mention one in particular. It's labeled as a viewpoint commentary, and it's titled Social Media Guidelines for Anatomists. It's written by Catherine M. Hennessy, Danielle F. Royer, Amanda J. Meyer, and Claire F. Smith. And the point they make in this commentary is a good one. That is, when we represent ourselves in social media as anatomists, we ought to adhere to the professional standards of our profession. Which makes sense, right? In particular, they mention something that has come up in this podcast before, and that is using human donor specimens properly and professionally and respectfully. Specifically, they propose a practice of anatomists obtaining informed consent from donors before sharing cadaveric material on social media. And maybe the image should be accompanied by a statement stating that. To read the whole commentary, just go to the link in the show notes or episode page, or find it at the AAA website at anatomy.org. I've said this before. Whenever I see a statement that, quote, the textbooks will have to be rewritten if this study is true, unquote, which I did recently, I always take notice and I look into it. This time, it's about immunity, which, honestly, I don't cover very deeply in my A&P course. We do most of that in other courses in our college's programs, so my job is to just give them some very basic ideas to go forward with. Even in my textbooks, I stick with the basic ideas that will get learners started, giving them just enough to navigate the practical applications of immunity that they'll likely encounter next. Okay, we all know what T cells and B cells in the immune system are, right? At least the basics. T cells are another name for T lymphocytes, and B cells are another name for B lymphocytes, and we know that each population of lymphocytes have various roles in immunity, often communicating and coordinating with each other to attack antigens or cells bearing antigens. You know, bacterial cells and cancer cells and virus-infected cells and so on. Except, of course, when things get messed up, maybe signals get crossed, and there are immune attacks on normal, healthy cells, thus producing a disease state. We call this autoimmunity because, in a very simplistic way of looking at it, we are attacking ourselves. This happens in type 1 DM, that is diabetes mellitus. In type 1 DM, helper T cells direct the killer T cells to attack the beta cells and the pancreatic islets, and that reduces insulin production. That really messes up our ability to maintain glucose homeostasis, which leads to all of the many damaging mechanisms of type 1 DM. Okay, so far nothing requiring a rewrite of any current textbooks. What's new is that a few months ago, researchers found a lymphocyte that is sort of a weird T cell, B cell sort of lymphocyte that expresses both the kinds of receptors we see on T cells and the kinds of receptors we see on B cells. It reminds me of my favorite cartoon character, Cat Dog. Cat Dog is part cat, part dog, just like this cell is part T cell, part B cell, has the characteristics of both, which is pretty curious, huh? So these researchers call them DE cells, which is short for dual expressor cells or dual expressor lymphocytes. But because they're sort of a cross of two well-known lymphocyte types, They're also sometimes called X cells or X lymphocytes. So, sounding even more like a cartoon character, right? The X cell. Besides this discovery being both an interesting curiosity and a necessary tool for preventing us from ever thinking that we have the human body completely figured out, it also helps us understand type 1 DM better. Why? Well, it turns out that the B cell receptors on these weird X cells include a special peptide that is not normally found among the highly varied receptors on typical B cells. And that weird receptor can very, very, very strongly bind, wait a minute, that's 3 varies. It can very, very, very strongly bind to an HLA called HLA-DQ8, which is thought to present insulin to T cells and thus trigger an attack. Because it binds so strongly, remember 3 varies, it binds so strongly, the likelihood of triggering an anti-insulin attack is that much more likely than just a, small random skirmish that may not end up producing a disease state at all. But when these weird X cells are around with their particular form of B cell receptor, acting like helper T cells by triggering killer T cells to attack insulin, well then it's a full-on war. And that war progresses beyond attacking the hormone to also attack the pancreatic beta cells, making the insulin. The researchers telling this new version of the story think this is just the beginning stages of type 1 DM, and their discoveries, if they pan out to be accurate in the long run, could give us a way to watch for and monitor the onset of type 1 DM, something we can't really do right now. But there really are a lot more questions here than potential answers. Besides some holes in a more detailed version of the story that still need filling in, there's the question of, where these X cells come from and how they develop. I mean, we know a lot about T cells and B cells, and they're even named for where they develop, but we don't know that about these X cells. So, not ready for textbooks yet, nor for our A&P course. Except, I think it might be an interesting aside to share with students, if the occasion permits, to let them know that there's still a lot to learn about human anatomy and physiology. The free distribution of this podcast is sponsored by the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology instruction, the HAPI degree. As educators, I wonder if we always value education as highly as we think we do. How many of us stop taking courses after we get that last degree? We head off into teaching often without having any kind of degree or certificate in teaching. I wonder if we're being the best we can be with this mindset. Why don't you check out this online graduate program at nycc.edu/HAPI, that's HAPI, or click the link in the show notes or episode page. This segment is all about making mistakes. I listen to a few podcasts that typically end with a so-called blooper reel, in which outtakes or mistakes that have been edited out of the body of the podcast are played as a sort of comical diversion. I don't do that. It's not because I don't make mistakes. I make more than my share of them. But I just cut them out as I'm doing my editing. It never really occurs to me in the rush to get it all done that I should do anything other than delete them. Sorry about that. If you really love to hear bloopers, you're not gonna. Trust me, my mistakes are just sad. They're not funny. Well, okay, sometimes they are funny, and I actually laugh at them when I make them, but I never really think about preserving them while I'm making my mad dash through the editing process. Sometimes my mistakes actually make it out into the airwaves. like in the last episode, in which I recounted a previous episode in which I marveled at the examples of how people with no visible olfactory bulb could still sense odors okay. Except that I stated, and stated consistently several times, that they could hear despite having the lack of both olfactory bulbs. Despite it being a huge mistake about a very basic idea, I didn't catch it as I said it, nor when I edited the segment, nor when I listened to the processed sound file, nor when I played it the first time in the podcast player just to make sure that it all got out there okay with the correct episodes file and all that. It wasn't until I let it restart and play in the background that I noticed the mistake, and I hardly ever let it play in the background, but for some reason I did for the last episode. It's a good thing. So once I caught it, I fixed it in the sound clip for that segment, redid all my processing steps, and then republished it before very many of them had been downloaded by listeners. Maybe you're one of the lucky few that has that rare copy downloaded that has me saying the wrong thing. You ought to save that because someday it's going to be, no, it's not ever going to be worth any money. Don't save it. Please don't save my mistake and preserve it, okay? Like any of you, I make mistakes in my teaching, my writing, and, well, in just about everything I do professionally. In my early career, it kind of shocked me that I never stopped making mistakes. Not the same ones, generally, but I had this weird notion that mistakes stop happening once a person has reached a certain level of training and had some experience and success in their profession. Yet here I was, making it relatively unscathed through several advanced degrees and becoming very successful in teaching, writing, speaking, and academic leadership, and yet still making mistakes. And the more visible and audible my work became, the more people could see my mistakes. I think that early on, I was probably developing what some folks call the imposter syndrome, which I explained a bit in the word dissection part of the preview episode that precedes this full episode. It's not a pathology, but a way of thinking that was first identified in successful professionals back in the late 1970s. Put simply, it's when a person doubts one's own accomplishments and feels somewhat of a fraud in living the life of an expert. It apparently happens a lot in academia because, well, we're professional experts, right? Paid to teach and to profess our expertise. Depending on a huge variety of wildly different factors, we could feel guilty about not being perfect. And when we are acknowledged for our success or our expertise, we could feel that we're somehow pulling something over on everyone. The thinking behind the so-called imposter syndrome or other similar mindsets can be dangerous in many ways, not the least of which is not valuing mistakes. Yeah, mistakes are extremely valuable. And I'll circle back to that notion in a minute, but first I want to say that whether they're valuable or worthless or a liability doesn't really change the fact that we're going to make mistakes. It's a law of nature, right? Lucky for me, I learned that lesson early. And over the course of decades, I think I've learned to live with and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, value my mistakes. When I do value them, or at least don't dwell on them, thus letting them generate anxiety and guilt, I'm a lot happier person, a more productive professional, and in some ways, better off for those mistakes. The ones that don't actually harm me or others, but sometimes even those. The reason I bring this up is that recently I've heard and overheard remarks from my peers about mistakes they've made or mistakes they fear making. Remarks like, how can we hold our students to a standard when we ourselves sometimes slip up and fall short of that standard? Now, my first thought when I hear these things is, yep, right? I feel your pain. But my next thought often goes right back to those mentors I've had who've helped me look at these things in a different way. A way that is more realistic and more self-accepting. And also more productive and useful, it turns out. And yes, once again, I have some stories from the olden days, from early lessons from my mentors. One story is from my wild animal training days. Before I was an apprentice lion tamer, I was an apprentice sea lion trainer. My mentor, Jim Alexander, was and is a serious student of wild animal training, and he taught me a lot. One early lesson occurred after we'd both gone to see an educational demonstration that featured trained wild animals. It was phenomenal. As usual, Jim used Socratic questioning afterward to make sure I learned something from the experience. He asked if I noticed any mistakes in the behaviors in the show. At first, I couldn't think of any. Then with some prompting, I remembered some pretty big flubs, where an animal didn't do what they'd been trained to do. And he said, "But it seemed like it went extremely well overall, right?" Yeah? Well, he eventually got me to see that the trainer's reaction to the mistake was the key. Unlike some other trainers we'd seen together who'd get flustered when mistakes occurred, this trainer acted amused by the mistakes. He laughed them off and carried on with a cheerful demeanor. Jim pointed out that mistakes always happen, even if you and the animals are well prepared, and you have to have a strategy to deal with that. Not letting it upset you, he pointed out, is the best strategy. Or at least acting like it's not upsetting you, to seem as if it's all part of the fun. And he pointed out when you do that, it actually does become part of the fun, and the flustered feeling really can dissipate. He also pointed out that some of the mistakes we saw were turned into moments of laughter. He mused that the trainer was likely to even try to mold that mistake into a new and amusing behavior. It turns out that not long after that, I was training a new sea lion for our show and would bring her out before showtime to both get her used to crowds and to show people how animals are trained. I was trying to get Yvonne the sea lion to catch some rings that I was tossing to her. She was really good at it and was quickly becoming an expert. But all that practice didn't seem to help my pitching arm very much, and during a pre-show training demo, where I had several friends in the audience who'd never seen me perform with animals, I threw a wild pitch that Yvonne could not possibly catch. The audience winced. I probably did too. A mistake in front of a crowd, including some friends that I wanted to impress. Well, almost immediately, Yvonne, anticipating a potential reduction in fish snacks, ran over to the ring, grabbed it in her mouth, threw it up in the air, and caught it around her neck like she was supposed to. Phew! I remembered my lesson from Jim, and I laughed it off. And from that day forward, that last ring being missed became part of the act. Far more entertaining than the original behavior, and far more enriching for the animal. I know it's sort of a cliche to say we should look at mistakes as opportunities. But once I really started experiencing that, it started to become a habit. And I've gotten a bit better at it. Not yet a master, but better. And at the very least, it's saved me some frustration and self-doubt that I'd have otherwise experienced. Of course, as we get better at particular skills, we make fewer mistakes, and that's our goal, right? And if we try new things, well, it's just expected that we're going to have pretty many mistakes until we settle in, or maybe just decide to abandon that new thing and try something different. If we let these kinds of mistakes get us down, it's going to damage us little by little. These kinds of mistakes are learning opportunities and not reflections of our overall competence or worth. But that cliche of mistakes being potential opportunities, even though true, is not really the point I want to share today. Really what I'm trying to get at in my idiosyncratic, meandering way is that it's okay, really okay, to make mistakes sometimes. Mistakes in teaching, mistakes in writing, mistakes in helping students. We all make them. Not just beginners, but even those who've been doing this for a long, long time. Making occasional mistakes is a sign of humanity, a sign of being human, not a sign of weakness, incompetence, or any level of worthlessness. It's not that we should strive to never have feelings of failure or guilt or embarrassment. It's that it's okay to make mistakes and have those embarrassed feelings, but still not see it as a negation of our professional expertise or our personal worth. Beyond that, though, is the lesson that our students will learn if we can face our mistakes in our courses with grace and humility, perhaps even with some amusement, and show students how true professionals can accept mistakes, even express some dismay, and still keep going, working to avoid future mistakes, but not being done in by the fact that we do make mistakes, and sometimes even make them in public. This lesson of not taking ourselves too seriously may, in the long run, be much more valuable to our students than knowing the role of olfactory bulbs in smell, or hearing, or taste, or whatever. I don't know. What is it again? Marketing support for this podcast is provided by HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. Go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. That's HAPS. I think a lot of HAPS members don't think much about the one-day regional HAPS meetings that occur on weekends at various times of the year and various locations around North America. Hey, maybe today's a good day to go to the approfessor.org/HAPS and check out the full list of regional meetings. Hey, you probably forgot about that survey that I've been taking. I'm asking you now to please take just a few minutes of your time to respond to that anonymous survey, because it's your experience as an individual listener that's important to me. Just go to the approfessor.org/survey. And as always, thanks for your support. Hey, don't forget that I always put links in the show notes and at the episode page at the approfessor.org in case you want to further explore any ideas mentioned in this podcast, or if you want to visit our sponsors. And you're always encouraged to call in with your questions, comments, and ideas at the podcast hotline. That's 1-833-LION-DEN or 1-833-546-6336. Or send a recording or written message to podcast@theapprofessor.org. I'll see you down the road.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Dr. Kevin Patton, an award-winning professor and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
This episode should be taken once daily with food.